Hello, 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 ladies and gentlemen. You are listening to the Westcliffe Climb. And after just a few technical difficulties, because it wouldn't be tradition if I didn't get on here with my good friend, Dr. Paul Looney, if we didn't have some technical difficulties. However, we are on now. It's been a while since we've had Paul. So I just thought it'd be fitting, like a professional basketball game. Whenever they announce the players before they come out. That's how I feel like we should bring Paul back in. It'd be something like, you get that music going. It's got that pounding beat. And then all of a sudden what they say is they go, at psychiatrist, 6 foot tall from Willis, Texas, Paul Looney. See, that's what they would do. There it is.
Thanks for the extra 2 inches you gave me, John.
Oh man, how are you?
I'm doing good, especially at 6 feet tall. I've never been there yet. Great.
Oh man, fantastic. Well, hey, it's absolutely fantastic having you back on. What's on your heart? What's on your heart and what's on your mind? Because we had some conversations here offline about how to better respond to culture, what's happening, spending less time reviewing the content that we were putting out, and God willing, connecting with our community, our people, and the trials and struggles that they may be having here in the present, here and now. So what are you thinking?
Well, the title that you and I agreed on for our podcast today is The Surprising Link Between Suffering and Happiness. Obviously, as you said, people are going through trials. We've gone through a really rough season, and as Jesus predicted, there would be wars and rumors of wars. There would be earthquakes and flooding and famine, and so we've been seeing some of the devastating effects of climate and poverty and war, and all the aftermath of the pandemic. I think there's a lot of people who are struggling with how to respond to the trials and tribulations of life and suffering, how it impacts us.
Yeah. Just from a clinical standpoint, when you look at just the last 2 years, what are you seeing that's been trending and consistent issues with folks now, especially after everything that they've been through the last 2 years?
Well, I think for me, one of the big things that has happened, and I think there are forces at work, evil forces, the powers and principalities, always at Satan's beck and call to kill, steal, and destroy. And we get hit hard times. One of the things that I think has been so striking in the last couple of years with the pandemic is that the powers that be, both invisible and visible, believed that getting us to isolate was going to serve their purpose, whether that be a positive or diabolic purpose. And I think that what we've seen is that the pandemic itself was stressful with the loss of life and disability, illness. But the big thing I think that has been so damaging is isolation. Even just wearing masks caused a certain disconnect in terms of our ability to connect with people with our facial expressions, with our smiles, with our speech. And I think that isolation is exactly what the enemy wants, to take us out more easily. That in fact that the Apostle Peter says that the enemy is like a roaring lion, prowling, seeking who he may devour. And I think I've said before that that when you're in isolation, you are much more easily taken out of commission. And even now, even though the big threat of the pandemic is over, people are still more isolated. Fewer people are gathering at churches and synagogues and places where they congregate. Now, sports are getting back in there, but We just won the World Series here in Houston.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
you're an Astros fan, you're happy about that. But I think overall we're still suffering from that isolation and from the fear that has been generated partly by circumstances and partly by the messages that have gone out from those in the medical community and political sphere.
So let me ask you this then: is because there's nothing better than a Monday morning quarterback. We all know that. What? Okay, pandemic round two. Here it comes, rolling in. 2024, baby. Here we come. What? Knowing what we know now, and I know we're speaking from just as much of the isolation, mental, emotional, spiritual side of this whole thing and the toll that it took. If we could do this again, okay, let's just say we roll into this whole thing again. Um, what would you say would be maybe the top two or three major considerations that we need to have?
Well, I think this is a topic we should really delve into at some point. The short answer, so we can get on with our talk about the link between suffering and happiness, is that what we found through countries like Sweden, who didn't take all the measures that we did, that what we thought about flattening the curve and isolating and using masks was wrong. And they originally rolled it out as a couple of weeks. We're just going to do this for a couple of weeks and flatten the curve, and it just went on and on. And I think that those are the measures that we know were ineffective, and we would do differently. They've had taken an enormous toll on children in particular, and so I would hope that we would handle it much more effectively. When the pandemic first started, I posted a video called the C.S. Lewis, The Pandemic, and the Loony Doctor, or something like that. And I quoted C.S. Lewis in his response to the atomic bomb and people's fear about being bombed and the destruction of civilization. And his point was that there have always been threats to life and limb. Through the Middle Ages, there were the plagues. And his point was that we should keep doing life as in the same way that London did in the air raids, that keep calm and carry on. And that's really what I was hoping we would be able to do. Didn't work out very well, but I think that if you understand God's sovereignty and his ability to use suffering in a powerfully positive way, it gives you the ability to carry on and to not cower in fear. In fact, during the plagues, the rich people would flee the cities, go to their country villas, whatever, to avoid the plague, while the Christians would go into the city to care for the suffering. And that's really the gist of finding happiness in the face of suffering, is pressing in rather than pulling away.
Amen. So sorry for that detour. You know what that conversation was? That was like, we're on a highway headed to a destination. I'm like, look, a Buc-ee's, well, we did the Buc-ee's conversation. So now we're back on the freeway, suffering and happiness. Talk to me a little bit more about the connection, because that would indeed be, as the title says, a surprise. Help us see it.
Yes. So one of the people ask me often as a psychiatrist, how do I sit with people day after day who are in the midst of the worst suffering, dealing with chronic illness or the threat of death, dealing with divorce, the loss of a loved one to suicide, depression, anxiety, panic attacks? How do I manage to stay sane and stay positive in the face of that? And my response generally is something like the knowledge that in my own life and in the lives of those that I serve, time after time, when people go through that dark valley and come out the other side, they look back with a sense of gratitude, not just that they survived the onslaught, but they found themselves stronger because of it, found themselves more equipped to be a citizen of heaven because they've experienced a little bit of hell on earth. It's remarkable how that works. And even a couple who, for instance, goes through the aftermath of an affair, which can be so devastating to the marital bond. But those couples that actually decide to work through it and to press on will uniformly tell me our marriage is better, stronger, deeper, wider than it ever was before the affair, and that God used it, although they would not wish the journey on any of their enemies, let alone their friends. They realize that God is capable of bringing great good out of great evil.
Wow. So, I mean, is part of the theory that suffering, what do you think it uniquely does? I mean, as I'm listening to you in the context of a marriage, is it that it rips apart every sense of control we ever had? Is it that it obliterates every plan that we had? Is it basically that it just kind of reduces us down to a powder that finally God can blow in one direction or the other? I mean, what is that dynamic? What do you think suffering breaks down in us, that when we get on the other side of it, we can almost be thankful for it and we're a better human being for it?
Well, I'm sure that every person who goes through suffering is being provided a unique experience that cuts to the heart of what they need. But I think you're exactly right that one of the main things is that sense of powerlessness and being confronted with our own inability to orchestrate circumstances or control outcomes, that really puts us at God's mercy and thrusts us into that place where we are stripped of our normal defenses, and we have to lean into authentic communication with God and with other people in order to navigate that terrible time. So I think, Paul says in Romans 5 that suffering produces endurance, endurance produces character, and
Yeah.
character produces hope, which does not disappoint us. There's that hope of transformation that we will ultimately, as the Apostle John says, when we see him as he is, we will be transformed, we'll be fully changed. But
Yeah.
in the meantime, it's through suffering and enduring trials that our character is forged and we become more like Jesus.
Wow. Wow, wow, wow. Yeah, I think the whole dynamic of people getting on the other side of it and not only getting through it is one thing, but then to turn around and be thankful, almost have a heart of gratitude for what that did for them. That's truly that's profound. Um,
Well, it's interesting. There's a book called The Happiness Hypothesis. It's by Jonathan Haidt, and one of the chapters, chapter 7, is on adversity. And he makes the point early in the chapter that um, when we have a child, if we knew all of the major life events, the glorious and the gory, the gross and the good, we would be tempted, if we had the ability, to edit out all the adversity, all the bad things that might happen to them, a car wreck, a divorce, the loss of a girlfriend, the loss of physical health. We would be tempted to edit out all the suffering. And I know for me, if I had been able to edit out some of the suffering that I experienced as a child, I would be tempted to do so. I think everyone wants to spare their child suffering. But it goes on in the chapter to eliminate how, if we did that, if we did spare our children from suffering, we would actually be handicapping them, because the evidence is very clear that if you get to age 25 and the biggest um, pain that you suffered was not getting the automobile you wanted on your 16th birthday, you're in trouble, because the research shows that enduring hardship and suffering early in life is what helps to forge character, to create endurance and courage and compassion. And so the people that are spared any suffering in childhood are at a disadvantage. The scripture says it's a good thing for a person to bear the yoke in his youth. And so there are definite advantages to our being hit hard by life, early in life, and it produces an ability to be resilient, to bounce back after suffering. That if you miss that window, if you don't have it early in life, it's very difficult to develop later in life, like learning languages, for instance.
Well, so I look at it like, okay, God's always playing four-dimensional chess. We're a group of people in a three-dimensional world. Things happen to us, and he's over it, and he's under it, and he's through it, and we're, for us, it's all a new surprise, and for him, he's like, yeah, I saw that one coming before you ever took your first breath. But what I wonder is from the human, our linear life, human example, I'm curious with the people who get on the other side of suffering, who even have a heart of gratitude, that are made stronger on the other side, everything, that things are up a notch after it. Do you see any common thread of, like, at some point in there making a decision, I am going to survive this. I may not thrive in it, but I am going to survive. I mean, do you ever hear that? Do you hear that thread come across a person going, just kind of gritting their teeth and going, this isn't going to break me. It's going to come close, but I'm not going to let it break me, one step at a time. What would you say there?
I think that's exactly right. I'm reminded of the old children's story, the little engine that could. I think I can. I think I can. I think I can. There is that sense. Nietzsche, the philosopher, said, "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger." And it does turn out that faith is what overcomes the world. Faith is the victory that overcomes the world. And as we cultivate our faith and our trust in God, if we lean into Romans 8:28, it says, we know God is at work in everything for good if we love him and yield to his purpose. If we are called to his purpose of transformation, then it does give us that ability, like you're saying, to say, I'm holding on. And you look at someone like Job, whose wife encouraged him to throw in the towel, just curse God and die. And he could not allow himself to let go of his conviction that God was still good and God was still God, even in the face of unimaginable suffering. And that's really the challenge for all of us, is to ask ourselves, do I trust that God is still good and he is still God in the face of this challenge? James says in chapter 1 that we should have joy when we meet various trials. So whenever you get hit hard, it's, God's giving you some joy practice. Can I count this? Can I consider it as something good in the face of undeniable bad?
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So let me ask you this. People that are listening to us, we probably got two camps, mostly. One that's in the middle of a mess right now. One that may have gotten on the other side of a mess here recently. Yeah. So my question is, for those that are in the mess right now that are listening, I'm assuming there are some threads that you see, some patterns of healthy reflection in the middle of it.
Sure.
Whether it's a healthy question that you're asking yourself or just kind of what you're examining. What would you kind of give that person as maybe a question or a thought that they need to kind of put in their heart, deposit in their heart this week while they're in the middle of their mess? What would you say?
Well, I think we all need a philosophy of life that includes suffering. Suffering is a part of being human, and we need a philosophy of life that encompasses suffering and puts it in a context where we can relate to it well. There's a wonderful TED Talk by a woman by the name of Kelly McGonigal that I recommend to all of our listeners. It's maybe 17 minutes, but Kelly McGonigal is a brilliant communicator. She's a stress researcher, and she starts out her talk by making confession that she had vilified stress as a bad thing because there are years of research showing how people undergoing great stress are at risk for things like heart attack and stroke, and how it can lead to trauma in particular, can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder. So stress can be bad, but what she brilliantly illuminates in the talk is that it's what we believe about stress that makes all the difference. That people with high levels of stress, if they believe that stress is part of the deal and part of what we should expect, and that it can be used to ramp up our energy to resist those slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, rather than give in to them, she says that a couple of things really make a difference. And One is, again, just believing that stress is not bad and I don't have to try to avoid it. I can lean into it. Second thing she suggests is that when we're under stress, our body produces stress hormones like cortisol, but it also produces extra uh, oxytocin, which is the bonding hormone. And so people who do well under stress are people who are willing to reach out for support and help when we have our support groups like Tuesday Night at the Church in Restoration. We invite people to reach out to get the support and help they need. And so whether you're in the trenches at wartime or going through a difficult time in your marriage, if you can manage to reach out to your comrades or to your companions, to your mate, and hold together in the face of that difficulty, then not only do you get through it better, but you forge deep bonds when you go through adversity with people and maintain that connection. So people, I just lost my father-in-law during just before the pandemic, and he was 95 and served in World War II and was connected with his buddies that he served with up until the last of them passed away. There's just that bond that suffering creates, not just with others, but also with God himself, and it forges a connection with our own sense of who we are and our identity, that when you climb a 14er in Colorado or suffer some dark valley, you come out of the other side with a greater sense of who you are and what you're made of.
That was a great answer. You should consider doing this for a living. So just to transition then to the second half of the question, and I'll use this just what the old Duffy front porch example is. My one of our children has just had a tough time on our street for a couple of years now. It's just, I'm biased. I think she's a very cool kid, but she's just had multiple times where for some reason it's not connecting with other kids. And some of the ways that they disconnected with her were kind of cruel and harsh, honestly. And, but what I noticed is somewhere even in her beautiful little brain, she connected that feeling to making sure that someone else didn't feel that. So what I've noticed on the other side of this is when we have someone new come on the street, she will invite them into what's happening immediately.
Nice.
And I really firmly believe that sensitivity or that compassion towards others was rooted in something that was actually painful. And so it's a beautiful thing as a parent, because you don't have to kind of go, hey, you knew what that was like. She already knew what it was like. You didn't have to explain it. So that's kind of my lead in then to what was the part two, is when you think about people now who just got on the other side of it and they're like, wow, that happened. What kind of connections, thoughts, questions, reflections do you like to see a person kind of walk through in phase two here?
Well, I don't think you could have illustrated it more beautifully, Josh, than your daughter's response, because the thing about suffering that makes it endurable is if it is redemptive, if it changes us for the better or empowers us to make a difference. And this is really what Joseph points out to his brothers when they're shaking in their boots, afraid that he's going to take revenge on their violence toward him, and throwing him in a pit, plotting to kill him, selling him into slavery. And they're afraid that he's going to pass on the pain. He's going to pass it back to them. But Joseph's response to them is so beautiful. He says, am I in the place of God? Like, it's not my job to pay you back. He says, what you did, you meant for evil, but God meant it for good, to the saving of many souls. Joseph was uniquely positioned to make a difference in the ancient world at a time of famine because God had provided for him to be in Egypt through the hardship of slavery and betrayal and imprisonment. That all of that was part of the path toward prominence and for provision for other people. So your daughter is embodying that in the most beautiful way, that her pain provides her the provision for others, that she's able to show compassion. And I think that the big difference between people who undergo suffering and how it impacts them depends on whether they're willing to do the work to process their pain so they don't just pass it on. They absorb it. And the cross really is where God absorbs the pain of evil into his own body and responds with that heart of love. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. So we can either come through trauma with PTSD, where we have post-traumatic stress disorder, we're panicky, we're bitter, we're disempowered, or we can come through like your daughter with what you could call PTG, or that the trauma itself, the suffering itself, produces something in us that we can be profoundly grateful for.
I love it. Love it. And thank you, Leanne, for checking us out. Leanne Crow says, awesome talk.
I love you, Leanne. She's one of our lay counselors at the church. We have 60 lay counselors now, and Leanne is doing a great job.
Fantastic. That's awesome. Well, I also want to say, what I love about your Joseph reference is, Joseph basically names his children high level, like I have victory over this. I've gotten past this. I've moved on, and what I thought is also so cool about people processing their pain, and the example in Joseph is when he first sees his brothers and has his brothers recounting that whole childhood experience, not knowing that he's the one listening, he goes back into crying, mourning, and, goes through it. But yet, I think because, to your point, he's processed it well, he's still able to make godly, faithful decisions. But I guess also just to remind people, just like in that story, there's times where those feelings and emotions are going to come back, but it sounds like he had processed it well. And he was able to move forward and make healthy decisions. You know?
Well, the other response I have to your question is that when we are in the dark places is really where we find out if we have true faith or not. It's in those darknesses where God can show up for us in a profound way that we will not find him in the sunny days. If you look at Psalm 23, there's a beautiful transition in the Psalm where David begins by talking about the Lord in third person. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me by still waters. He restores my soul, leads me in paths of righteousness. But then there's a beautiful transition when he says, even if I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. He goes from third person to second person. He directs his psalm to God himself. And it's what happened with Job, who says at the end of all his suffering, I had heard of you with my ears, but now my eye sees you. And that's really, for me in my own life, it's in those times of deep suffering that I encounter God in a more powerful way, like Jacob did, wrestling with God when he's facing death. He believes that Esau is very likely to annihilate, to destroy him when he shows up. And so facing death and his fears head on, he wrestles with God and receives a blessing. His name is changed. His identity is shifted because of that dark night.
Yeah, boy, I love that. Fantastic. We got one in the can, back in the game. Folks, please share this particular podcast. We're going to get it out on all of our platforms as well. We're going to be going with this new format, Wednesdays, 8 a.m. Central Time. Pam Menteri, operating in the shadows, deep in the Tomball wilderness, backs us up, and she has been posting a few links to actually a few videos that Paul and I had put out previously that touch on elements and aspects of today's conversation. Thank you again, Leanne, for checking in on us.
We love you.
And of course, this podcast is not just a live stream, but it'll go on several different platforms. And we will make sure and let you all know which platforms those are so you can stay engaged with us, check it out, re-listen to all of the madness, the goodness, and the deep insights that God has put in the middle of these conversations. So, with that in mind, Paul, welcome back. And would you mind closing us in a word of prayer?
Love to. Thanks, Josh. God, we are ever grateful for your great provision of grace through Jesus Christ. He is our lead. We are called to walk in his steps, that we would suffer well. And God, we know that in your kingdom, suffering well is of great value. Not only does it give us the context for growing into the character of Christ, we know that in eternity, that those that suffer with him will be glorified with him. And so help us to do as the Apostle Paul, and to rejoice in suffering, to count it joy when we meet trials, and to be encouraged in our faith and our hope that as we lean in to those dark valleys, that we would keep putting one foot in front of the other, knowing that you will bring us through, that you are with us in it, not just in a figurative way, but you feel with us the grief that we endure, and we can cast our cares on you because you care for us. We thank you. Thank you for Josh. Thank you for this time to be together. We ask your blessing on all of our listeners. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. We love you guys, and we will see you next week. Bye.
Bye-bye.